Welcome to the latest episode of WSP's Anticipate podcast. I'm your host, Omar Saif, a sustainability and climate change manager for WSP's advisory services business in the Middle East. Climate change continues to impact the availability of freshwater resources on our planet. As temperatures rise and weather patterns become more extreme, the amount of water available for consumption is decreasing. This is particularly true in areas that are already water stressed, such as the Middle East. In this episode, we will address the underlying factors that contribute to water scarcity and explore how countries in the Middle East can achieve greater water security in the face of climate change and other risks. I'm joined today by Alexander Euler, the Managing Director for Hydraloop Middle East, as well as Helen Bali, our Head of Water Networks at WSP in the Middle East. Alexander and Helen, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Pleasure to have you. Just to kick it off, we're talking about water security within the Middle East and perhaps more specifically the Gulf region. And before we really get into a lot of the discussion points and dive deeper into it, I just wanted to get a sense of what is the current situation in the regional context with respect to water. So where do we currently stand? How does the Middle East fare with respect to water security? And what are the primary drivers that are impacting it? So things like, whether it's population growth, urbanization, climate change. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
I think in the Middle East that there is a recognition that there is a problem, but I don't think the Middle East has really addressed the solution in its entirety at this stage. I think there's a lot of great initiatives out there, but I think, and I'm talking primarily across the GCC here, I think that there is still a lot of work to do. I'm sure you'd agree with me on that one, Alex, yeah?
Yeah, of course. Sometimes, let's say the regulations and the let's say quote the politics usually go a little bit behind the issues to in order to solve them. So we see that it is lagging a bit behind.
I mean, within the GCC region, we have some major challenges in front of us when it comes to water. And you mentioned population there, and I'd just like to highlight a really little fact that I discovered, that from the year 2000 to the current year, the population in the GCC has actually grown from 30 million to 54 million. That's an increase of 80% over the population. And that has to have a vast impact on the water supply to the region.
I agree. There's also, if I can add just a couple of points, is not only is there a trend towards population growth, logically, but also urbanization. So we have an increasing move to the cities in certain countries. So, for example, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, you do see that. In other countries, you have immigration. So expected immigration rate. So all that, in my opinion, adds to pressure being added to the infrastructures, to the regulations, to in the cities, basically.
And of course, when we're talking about urbanisation, people have much higher expectations of quality of life these days than they once had. So they don't want to walk down an empty, dusty street. They want to walk down a street which is beautifully planted and have nice green parks. And of course, that leads to another aspect of the water demand. But without dwelling on that, of course, the increase in population also leads us into the food security issues as well. And of course, food requires water. And another interesting fact is that within the region, roughly 85% of the region's water withdrawals are actually for agriculture. So whilst we all focus on the water, this is another area that we should be very cognizant of.
No, that's a great point, Helen. And I think, like you were saying, you kind of alluded also to the changing lifestyles, right, and the consumption habits. I mean, just looking at the region, not too long ago, maybe just 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago, largely nomadic population in the Arabian Peninsula, very minimal water requirements. Compared to now, you have one of the highest per capita consumptions in the world. You have one of the highest per capita GDPs as well, and that really reflects, I think, in consumption. So you had amongst one of the lowest water per capita consumption rates, perhaps 100 years ago, compared to now, one of the highest. And that's, I think, definitely part of the equation. And maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into that when we get into the behavioral aspects of water use in the region. With that, I'd also you mentioned Helen the usage of water. So just before we get into how water is used as well, I mean, what are the sources of water for in the region? You know, what are the supply options that are currently available, and where are they being utilized mostly?
Okay, well, when we look at the coastal regions, most of the water supply is coming from desalination from the Red Sea, from the Gulf. I'm talking primarily about the GCC, not about the Middle East in its entirety, because obviously when you start to move up into Egypt and Jordan, you come into other sources, such as the more natural water sources, should I say the groundwater sources. However, when you look at the GCC, we have very arid region that's going to be subject to a lot of climate change. We have a groundwater that is been formed over millions of years in deep aquifers, and we have the sea surrounding it. But beyond that, there's not a lot in big rivers. There's not a lot in large, constantly flowing water.
Yeah. And mostly downstream rivers, might I add. I mean, for a lot of countries in the Middle East, whether it's Egypt, Iraq, or other ones, they're downstream riparian countries, and that definitely presents a whole range of climate-related issues and risks moving forward. So that's we see this playing out currently in Egypt with some of the negotiations going on with respect to the Nile River. So that's definitely an issue. So you highlighted desalination. That's definitely a major one for a lot of the Gulf countries. What are some of the main issues around desalination? I mean, it has often been described as a form of modern alchemy, right? You're instead of switching things to gold, but you're actually taking seawater and making it into fresh water, and the idea does in fact sound like magic. But what are the repercussions of it?
Sure. I mean, the desalination itself has its own challenges, and whilst a lot of people see it as the ideal solution, it may not necessarily be. For a start, it's definitely known for being energy intensive, which comes with carbon costs. It comes with monetary costs as well, and whilst it's sort of increasing in use, that means it's accounting for a larger and larger percentage of the total energy consumption in the Middle East. But in addition to the energy, there's other things that people don't think about. And one of these relates to the intakes and the marine life that sits around those intakes. Of course, when you're sucking water out of the sea, you're actually going to be having an impact upon marine life that would normally live in those habitats. So it has the environmental aspect. And then we have the byproducts that are produced by the desalination. We have chemical demands and chemical disposal because we end up using a lot of chemicals in the pre-treatment process. And then we have the big one, which is the brine. And when we produce every litre of fresh water, we produce more than that of brine, and that brine has to be disposed of. Now, we can retreat it and actually reduce the amount of brine, thicken it up. We can use saline beds. Historically, this has been discharged to the marine environment, and if it's discharged to a water body with restricted movement, that can actually have an impact on the salinity of that water. And again, on the habitats of any wildlife that might be living there. Other people have discharged it to the sewer, but when it gets to the sewage treatment works, that will cause a major process problem. And I've even heard people talk about discharging it to the aquifers, which is really the last thing you want to do because you start to pollute your aquifers with saline. So yes, it has benefits, and the energy you can account for through the use of renewable energy, which is a route being followed by some of the larger developers within Saudi Arabia. But it's not the whole answer.
And just as a quick follow-up on that, I mean, we do see that there's a major shift happening in terms of the desalination technology in the region, where historically the Gulf really utilized thermal-based desalination technology, where they were just distilling it after evaporating it out. And now there's a major shift towards membrane-based, like reverse osmosis. And Just kind of curious, what takeaways do we have as a result of this transition? I mean, some are claiming that it can enable the energy transition, it can enable decarbonizing water. Just any thoughts on that?
Certainly, I think it will help with the decarbonisation of the water. It gives you a lot more options to use the renewable aspects for powering those desalination plants. But this relies then on that energy being supplied from a renewable source, and that of course becomes the second part of the conversation.
No, absolutely. You did mention earlier when we were discussing the requirement also for agriculture being around 70% in the region of the overall freshwater needs. That is primarily coming from groundwater. So how does groundwater fit into the overall water security or water budget of Gulf countries or more broadly the Middle East? And is it a sustainable source of water?
Well, that is a very interesting question. I mean, traditionally and historically, these countries did rely on the groundwater. And the problem with this is a lot of that groundwater has been, they call it a fossil non-renewable source because a lot of that groundwater has accumulated over hundreds, thousands, millions of years. And the water is naturally being depleted because as it's being taken out, the groundwater is being depleted. It's being used, as you say, for agriculture, for domestic use. And there's a lot of predictions around that these resources are very time limited. In particular, there's been quite a lot of focus on the water resources in Saudi Arabia, where in 2016, one groundwater expert at King Faisal University actually predicted the kingdom only had another 13 years of groundwater reserves left. In 2008, the United Nations was talking in terms of 25 years. This is not a lot of groundwater if it carries on at the current consumption rates. On top of which, in 2019, a private intelligence and geopolitical analysis firm suggested that, in particular, Saudi Arabia is actually using more than 4 times the water that it renews. So this is a massive issue, and I think this is why there is such a focus on water in the kingdom now, because they rely heavily on the groundwater within the central areas, and this is something that really needs solutions.
No, absolutely. And Alex, I want to loop you in here now because we've been talking about some of the conventional sources of water, but let's talk a little bit unconventional, or particularly around greywater or treated wastewater. I know that this is an area that you're passionate about and that your company that you work for is very heavily involved in. So can you just tell us a little bit about treated wastewater, greywater, and what's the role of it in terms of the overall water security and water budget of the Middle East?
As you said, we're passionate about the efficient use of gray water. So for us, gray water pertains mostly to water that is within the urban environment. So water that is used for irrigation, for flushing toilets, for shower, for that kind of function. So our vision is that we have to be just more efficient in how we use water, because as Helen said, the water is at the end a finite source. So the more efficient we are in using our water, particularly the gray water, which accounts for about 85 to 90% of the water used in a home, the better. So we believe that the future also lies in how well we manage gray water. There are several technologies out there. Of course, our company obviously is one of the pioneers in this field, and we believe that is going to have a major impact as these countries become more urbanized.
Walk us through this, Alex. Let's say that I'm a homeowner. I have my gray water that's currently being discharged into the sewage system. You're suggesting that we capture that gray water and reuse it. What are the main benefits? So, one, to myself as a homeowner, and two, in terms of the country, the transmission distribution networks. I just want to understand, who are the beneficiaries of such a system and how does it cascade upwards?
It's a bit complex to determine who is the ultimate beneficiary, because it all depends on the policies of of each country. So, for example, if you have a very low water tariff, the ultimate beneficiary of saving that water would be the actual government, but indirectly, whoever is paying the taxes also. At the end, everybody is a beneficiary in saving water. Our approach is that, or our philosophy is that every building has its own water source, which is the gray water that is used once and sent directly to sewer after being used. We believe that if we can harness the water that is produced in the building at the building level, you avoid two things. You avoid the costs of producing, obviously, the water that you're saving by using it more than once, but also the transportation of that water. That, of course, impacts the budgets of the governments, but it also indirectly impacts the end user, because if the governments can save on their budgets for this kind of thing, it means there's more budget available for other things, such as hospitals, schools, whatever the country needs.
And if I was just to ask you, what is the biggest, from your operations and your experience here in the Middle East so far, what is the biggest challenge, the biggest single challenge that you think is facing greywater reuse?
Honestly, I believe perhaps regulation. The regulation, I think it's a bit behind the technology. So logically, the tariff incentives can also be problematic. So we believe that if let's say the tariffs are at a level that reflects the true value of water, then there is an incentive to actually save water. So I think it's around regulation and understanding what kind of technology is out there that can really help solve the problem.
No, thank you for that. I think that's quite useful now. I mean, having discussed a bit of the desalination, groundwater sources, as well as the gray water, and perhaps also treated wastewater, the role of that also in the national water budgets. Um, just kind of moving on now, we talked about the water supply aspect, but then we know that the big part of the issue in the Middle East is also around the actual connecting it to the end users. So the transmission and the distribution systems. There is a big disparity, I believe, between the Gulf and perhaps other Middle Eastern countries where there are significant network losses. Helen, I know that this is an area that you're quite active in. So could you perhaps just shed some light on it, and how important is the network aspect of water?
Okay, let me start from the beginning. I mean, one of the areas you said there is a big disparity, but there's also very, very large spending programs on this in most of the Gulf countries at the moment. For myself, I was personally involved in a major project in Qatar, extending their water reserves to provide 7 days storage or 30 days under emergency scenarios. And I know in Qatar they're moving forwards, looking at options for replenishing the aquifers with any surface water that they're treating, surplus water that they're treating. In parallel, there's been other major projects in the GCC countries. And for example, in the United Arab Emirates, they're now currently targeting 45 days of water storage for extreme emergencies. So in terms of the storage of the water once it's been treated, there's been a lot of effort into that. The secondary part of that, of course, is the transmission of that water around the region. And this is where we really get into the subject of water audits and leakage management. And generally, we're talking about what we call non-revenue water here. And the non-revenue water is water that has been lost before it reaches the customer. Now, losses can be real losses, physical losses, such as leaks, or what we call apparent losses, which is effectively the metering. And probably in this region, both of these are a little bit behind on the curve. Physical losses, for example, where we have the older networks or poor construction. And there's a real need to get up to speed with proper leakage monitoring and district metering, for example, or flow metering on long pipeline lengths, smart technology such as smart balls, acoustic technology. And on all new systems, we really should be looking at putting in systems such as fiber optic technology to identify any leaks as they occur on the pipelines or reservoirs. And then, of course, we have the apparent losses, as I mentioned earlier, which are the ones more related to metering. In this region, we find quite a lot of this related to sort of farms, government facilities, and high-profile residences. And whilst some of these places may not particularly want to be monitored, the benefit of actually metering these is that then you can identify how much you really are losing through leakage and how much you're losing even through theft, because of course people make illegal connections. When you have a long pipeline and nobody seeing it in the middle of the desert, somebody will come and tap in. So, this is really an area that needs increased focus in this region, I think. I know that the various water authorities are actually focusing on it, but maybe it needs a little bit more focus to reduce the amount of water that is lost once it's treated.
Absolutely, Helen. And you also mentioned, I think, in the beginning of that, the just a point on reserves as well, or the strategic water reserves. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that in terms of why there is the need for these strategic water reserves or building these kinds of redundancies or additional measures? And Alex, I'd also like to get your thoughts on this as well. Because I mean, you look at it from a very different perspective, which is the greywater, like you mentioned, at a building level. So how does that also build resilience into the network? So maybe I'll start with you, Helen.
The need for this resilience is related to multiple factors. The first one is, of course, the subject we discussed earlier, where the water here is either from desalination or from aquifers, and that means that it relies upon treatment, it relies upon extraction. And if you're looking at desalination, for example, and you look at the Gulf or the Red Sea, if you have a major pollution event in one of those locations, you're at severe risk of cutting off the entire water supply to that area. And it's something that people don't want to talk about, but you have a lot of oil shipping in the region, for example. So if you have oil spills in one of the major areas where you have a desalination plant, you are going to have a problem. And in that regard, the secondary source of water would immediately become the aquifers. And of course, these aquifers have been depleted, going back to what we were saying about groundwater. So the major benefit here of creating that resilience is you give yourself time to resolve the problem. You give yourself time for plant maintenance, which is actually really important because it allows you to then actually get much more robust systems. And on top of which, if you're taking the route that they are now taking in some of the countries in the GCC of actually replenishing the aquifers as well, then that also gives you the secondary source of water in emergencies.
Oh, that's a really comprehensive answer. So thanks for that, Helen. I think you hit the nail on the head with that. Alex, just curious to hear your thoughts as well, more from that decentralized.
Sure, yeah. From the decentralization perspective, it goes back to efficiency, to using water as efficiently as possible within the building. So how it ties up with reservoirs, and it helps protect the amount of water being used by being as efficient as possible. So less water being taken from the reservoirs and less water going into the wastewater treatment plants. Also, with decentralization, as the name says it, since it's decentralized, you can match supply and demand in terms of population growth. So you take as much water and recycle as much water as you need as you grow as a population. So there's no large, let's say, intake and waiting for demand to come to it.
Can I just pick up on something that Alex mentioned there, which is actually the reduced demand on those reservoirs? Of course, one of the great things about that means that the more water recycling is introduced, the more those assets that are currently being developed at the moment will actually have capacity extending into the future. So we shouldn't think that what we're building now will effectively become redundant. What we should think is that maybe where something was planned for 2030, if you introduce the recycling, you can actually make it last until 2036 or 2030 or 2040, which impacts the budget, it impacts the carbon and the whole environmental aspect.
And even downstream, if I may add. I mean, if you're utilizing the grey water you're passing that water another time through the system at home or wherever you may be, that's avoided water or a reduced amount of water that you're sending downstream to the sewage treatment plants as well. So it's a delayed capex, not just upstream in the desalination plants, but also downstream in the sewage treatment plants.
Absolutely, and don't forget the networks in that as well.
And on top of that, on the downstream side, it makes the process more efficient because the output water is more concentrated, so easier to treat.
And of course, you're not pumping irrigation water back to properties if they can supply their own. So you've got major benefits in terms of the operational costs and the operational impacts as well.
Especially in areas where you have transport via truck, for example.
Well, that's certainly a lot of pros. I mean, did we just single-handedly solve the water crisis in the Middle East, or?
That's it. I guess the podcast is over. We solved it.
I
Well,
really wish it was that simple.
Me too.
no, but thank you both for those great points. And I did want to just move on to more on the demand side management. And we've been speaking a lot about the supply and increasing the supply or finding ways to extend the supply further through recycling, etc. But in terms of actually reducing it or really rationalizing our water consumption and demand, we alluded earlier and we mentioned that roughly 70% of the total water that's consumed in the region, particularly in the region, is going towards agriculture, and this is primarily being supplied by groundwater. So, with such a large amount on of the total water budget being going towards agriculture, which in most Gulf countries is contributing less than 3% to GDP. Um, the question is, how can we improve our agricultural policies in a way that really, not just agricultural, but also beautification and landscaping policies in a way that drives greater efficiency and really reduces that huge water burden that's currently put on the aquifers?
So let me start on the agricultural side of it. I think one of the areas, and this comes back to something that Alex mentioned earlier, is about policies and regulations. I think one of the areas that that the governments could be looking at would be to improve policies and regulations so that they focus on agricultural uses that are not high in demand of water. If you look at planting, for example, you'll find that some plants have much higher water demands than others. And at the moment, I don't think there's a recognition on that in the wider population. I think that's something that we as water engineers think about. But I think if you talk to somebody on the street and ask them which plant used the most water for irrigation, they would just look at you blankly. And of course, this affects agriculture and it affects the beautification. And I've been getting involved in a lot of master planning recently. One of the things I see a lot of people go saying is, let's put in these nice parks, let's put in these nice plants. And I don't hear a lot of people talking, and I keep finding myself reminding people that we should really be looking at more use of native drought-tolerant plants within landscaping. We should be thinking about careful planting solutions. I'm not saying we should go into hard landscaping. I'm just saying when we look at soft landscaping, we really need to start considering what we are planting and, in addition, how we are planting it. And irrigation systems that are using a lot more technology, such as moisture monitoring and physical controls to stop the water losses below the plants. There's a vast study area here that could be taken and implemented into a lot of the master plans that are going through at the moment, a lot of the work that is being constructed, where these new cities are being constructed, where these new developments are taking place, and really, really focusing on the water use of the planting, the farming, the crop irrigation, and how it is being done.
I'd like to add a point to what you're saying, Helen, especially on the agricultural bit as well. And I would take that more towards the national food security strategies that are set by each of the Middle Eastern countries. And we have to recognize that it's also different from country to country. So whereas in the Gulf, It might be about maximizing local food production because you want to have a safety cushion and not rely entirely on imports. Whereas now it's around 90% imports for most Gulf countries for most of their agricultural goods. You want to provide a bit more of a local cushion through local production. But that's not the case in a lot of other Middle Eastern countries, such as Morocco or Jordan or Lebanon, which rely on their agricultural sector for their actual economy. So it's a significant share of their overall GDP. So for there, it's not about producing locally to meet local demand as much as it is as producing locally to make a good profit on the international market and then being able to import food from whichever countries they need. And I mean, the reason I raise this is just it's good to be aware of what is the ultimate objective behind food production or the food security strategy. And I think in the Gulf, it's been clearly articulated that it's to maximize local food production and provide that cushion. And then accordingly, we have to, just as you rightfully mentioned, look at um, what crops can be grown that meet the local demand and in a way that is as resource efficient as possible and through growing mediums that are also resource efficient, whether it's in greenhouses, vertical farms, or other means using novel irrigation methods. So just starting from that policy and cascading it down all the way into the actual technology implementation.
And of course, thinking about Alex's passion for greywater, one of the areas that can be considered is where greywater. I know there's a lot of cultural issues around the use of greywater or TSE, etc., in agriculture, but certainly in the beautification, there's a lot of opportunity for the implementation of that. And I read somewhere that a lot of the treated sewage effluent is still not actually being reused. And for example, in the UAE, they have a policy where they're trying to maximise that reuse to 95% of all recycled water being retained. And this is a very classic example of where that water can be used. As I said, in the beautification, when it comes to the agricultural, I know it's much more sensitive. But again, it's something that can be reviewed and considered on a case-by-case basis.
I agree. Again, it goes back to regulation in many cases. So there are certain countries, for example, that allow for treated greywater to be used for beautification, and there are countries that don't allow it because the norms have not caught up with the technology that is available for treatment of greywater that makes it much safer than whatever the threshold was before.
Just to kind of complement the part about the beautification and also the agricultural aspect is I want to just discuss the broader, also more of the municipal water requirements, industrial water, and that's where we can, I think, start talking about tariffs as well. It's something that you highlighted earlier, Alex, the importance of it to your own business, even. So maybe I'll throw this question at you: is what kind of economic signals can we use or instruments to incentivize good water behavior? Is tariffs the ideal one, or how do you see it?
Well, I like to compare, let's say, decentralized modern greywater recycling technology to solar panels 10 years ago, where it was something that was novel, promising, but economically it didn't seem viable. It required incentives. It required government help to make it become mainstream. And now, solar energy is, I believe it's the cheapest energy to produce right now. If not, it's very close. So I think we're in that kind of situation right now. I don't think that just adjusting tariffs, meaning raising tariffs, is the solution. Obviously, that would have to be accompanied with an intelligent incentive scheme to the end user or to the, let's say, the developers, for example. So we've seen different models throughout the world. So specific requirements. So your home has to have this kind of equipment or versus that, or normative. So, for example, your home has to, new homes cannot consume more than X amount of cubic meters per month, day, year. And the incentive schemes I believe should go into directly to the consumer to incentivize and to create also awareness, which is very important. Or the consumer has to be aware that they're part of the solution, that they're part of saving water, and that this is good for them.
Can I just pick up on that? Sorry. I was going to talk about education actually as well, because I think that comes down to the awareness. And there are some great programs going on in the Middle East at the moment. You have, in 2012, you had Qatar launch their, or Karama launch their Tashid program with a focus on educating citizens and residents. And then in 2019, you had Saudi Arabia launch their Qatra.
The Katra, yes, that's right. Yeah, there are initiatives going through, which is good news. It's good news. We're in the beginning.
Interestingly, Saudi Arabia, they are planning to, or targeting to, reduce water consumption to 150 litres per head per day by 2030, which is much more aligned with the Western Europe values, actually.
That is correct. All the while, they're going to be seeing a population growth, so you can imagine the pressure to get this done. You also see you see some varied types of responses to this. So, for example, in Kuwait, there's already an incentive program being implemented, and we know tariffs will very likely go up in Oman, which I think they already started doing. In Saudi Arabia, they're going to be starting going up in conjunction with these programs. So things are moving. It's just that we wish to move faster because the issue is pressing, right?
I think they need to move as fast as possible, whether we wish it or not. It needs to, because of this depletion issue.
Well, I actually want to follow up on that point regarding the need to, accelerate this shift, and this point relates to the role of the private sector. You know, companies like Hydraloop, Alex, and others that are really into the efficiency and retrofit market, right? That can improve the efficiency of both energy and water across different building landscapes and the built environment. What I'd like to ask is, where do you see most of the activity currently happening in the efficiency market? And is there a correlation between that and tariffs, since we were just talking about that?
My observations obviously come from a very specific angle, which is greywater recycling. That's what we do. But I do notice also that there is a general focus on efficiencies in the built environment, in the home, within the building. So smart metering type of monitors, etc. That also add to the efficiencies. And of course, you can see, sorry, that the municipalities are also investing through, for example, the examples that Helen gave there in various parts of their infrastructure. And you have, of course, the ESCOs that are active throughout the region. So, for example, Etihad ESCO in Dubai that are part of the solution. From a greywater recycling standpoint, the way we look at it is it should be as decentralized as possible. It has to be cost effective and very easy to understand and easy to implement. And that is obviously a philosophy that we are following as a company, but we firmly believe that that's the correct formula. A bit like, again, going back to the solar panels. You know, in the old days, it would be these big complex installations, where now you see these kind of shingles that you put on your roof, and that's it. And it's easy to understand, it's easy to install them. You have it, boom, off you go. So that's where we see where the big change could be.
And just anecdotally, I can also just mention that having worked quite a bit on the energy management and energy efficiency in my own career, I have noticed that there are a lot of really novel and innovative companies that are just waiting to really jump into the Middle Eastern and Gulf market. They're just waiting for that right price signal that we were mentioning earlier with respect to the tariffs. And the moment I think we hit that price signal, we definitely will see quite a huge growth in the retrofit and efficiency market, both in terms of electricity and water, similar to how we saw with solar. The moment that solar reaches a certain price point and it's cost competitive with other sources, then it just exploded in the region. It's really incredible, in fact.
I totally agree. There's a slight difference in terms of water, meaning whereas you can produce more electricity in various ways, it's very hard to produce more water, except for, of course, the desalination plant. So there is that element that makes it a bit more of a finite resource than energy.
It is a more strategic resource. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
And just on the role of the private sector as well, I mean, we were talking more maybe from a retrofit efficiency market like ESCOs, but how about also the role of the private sector in facilitating some of the major infrastructure projects? So things like PPP projects for public-private partnerships, and whether it's desalination plants, wastewater treatment plants, transmission distribution. Maybe I can give this question to you, Helen, if you have any inputs on it.
I think when it comes to the PPPs, I mean, really, they are in there for the commercial aspect of it, but I think they also can get benefit out of reducing that water consumption. So when it comes to sort of incentivization and encouraging the improved water usage, they actually have the benefit, but they need to have contracts that encourage that as well. Because if you're just encouraging someone to be paid by the tariff for per cubic meter of water that they're generating, then they have no motive to produce less water. So there needs to be some sort of clever writing in some of these PPP contracts to encourage that as well.
That's a really great point, and I think that's something that really needs to be reflected in a lot of the contracts going forward, as you rightfully mentioned, whether it's on the desalination side or even for some of the other water infrastructure. So that is a wrap for our podcast. Unfortunately, we don't have as much time as this topic really deserves. Ideally, we could spend another few hours discussing this and really going into greater detail. But where I would like to leave it, as I would like to ask the both of you, is if you were given the ability to pursue a water passion project of yours, not really considering constraints and finances, what would you pursue and why?
For me, my passion would really be to get involved in the strategic water planning phase with some of the governmental organisations, and it would be to support them and work with them to look at the overall water balance rather than just the clean water or the dirty water, and to look at it from a very strategic level with a view to improving upon the policies and the strategic ideation, to be honest. That would be my passionate project.
So like a bird's eye view on the water budget and really going into the strategic
Absolutely.
allocations of it.
And,
Okay.
and looking at it from all aspects, all of this stuff that we've been discussing today, but really trying to help set policies and guidelines that would help the various countries improve upon what they're doing and move forward in a much more coherent fashion.
And what about you, Alex?
Well, I have to say that I'm in the middle of it. I am actually doing precisely what I want to do. So I am very, very satisfied to be part of a project where we go into people's homes and we make a change within the building, within the home. So we bring awareness. So I like to think of this as the Tesla of water that we're trying to put together. It's exciting. It's a beautiful project. The satisfaction of seeing people from their home, in their home, smiling because they're aware that they're saving water is really thrilling. So my let's say I'm in it. I'm doing it. I hope it lasts.
No, that's really wonderful to hear, Alex, and hopefully we can all join you in pursuing our passion projects as well. For me, I would definitely love to look at the similar to what Helen was saying, but especially around the link between water security and agricultural policy, something that I'm personally passionate about, and I'd really love to see the two come together in a sustainable way for the region. Two very important topics, and definitely worth pursuing. Alex and Helen, I want to thank you again for joining us today. You've shared fascinating insights into the challenging and untapped opportunities surrounding water security in the Middle East. And to our listeners, if you've enjoyed today's episode about water security, you can subscribe to our Anticipate podcast via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our SoundCloud channel to stay up to date for leading insights from industry experts and WSP's thought leaders.